You meet him not as a villain, but as a disciplined figure who learned early that speed belongs to those who never touch the ground. While others traded hours for wages, he positioned himself above the clock, letting time work beneath him instead. He discovered that ownership moves faster than effort, and distance from labor creates acceleration. What looked like ambition was actually insulation, layers between risk and consequence. You notice he rarely carried weight himself, preferring structures that carried it for him. Leverage became his silent companion, multiplying motion without multiplying strain. Where others saved slowly, he borrowed confidently, knowing gravity favors those already elevated. You realize growth was never about accumulation, but amplification. He learned to convert stability into momentum, using calm periods to build silent advantage. Loss never struck him directly. It diffused outward into systems designed to absorb impact. While others fear downturns, he treated them like clearance sales. You see how patience, when paired with scale, becomes dominance. Risk bent around him, redirected toward those standing closer to the ground. The system rewarded his position, not his effort. Over time, advantage compounded into inevitability. You begin to feel how distance from volatility creates speed. What started as insight hardened into routine. Eventually, growth became automatic, detached from intent. You sense the tragedy forming. Because momentum once gained, resists surrender. Control begins slipping the moment growth no longer requires awareness. You watch how advantage reshapes perception, convincing him the system responds to merit rather than position. Success whispers validation, drowning out the quieter signals of imbalance. He mistakes reinforcement for proof, unaware that structures now protect him from correction. Feedback arrives softened, filtered through layers, designed to preserve momentum. You sense how distance from consequence erodes judgment slowly, almost kindly. What once required calculation becomes instinct. The 6 mechanisms blur into habit, no longer tools, but environment. He stops asking whether growth is healthy, only whether it continues. Stability becomes leverage. Leverage becomes speed. You see how scale forgives errors that would destroy smaller lives. Mistakes dissolve into noise when surrounded by volume. The system absorbs shocks by pushing them outward, away from the center. You realize insulation creates blindness as efficiently as it creates safety. Warnings lose urgency when losses never reach the source. Comfort stretches risk tolerance without ever feeling dangerous. The ground beneath him grows hollow, though the surface remains firm. You feel the weight transferring downward, unnoticed by those above. Others carry the strain quietly, keeping the machine smooth. Growth accelerates precisely because resistance has been removed. Collapse begins invisibly when correction becomes impossible. You begin to see how wealth stops being a tool and becomes a mirror, reflecting success back, until self-doubt disappears entirely. The absence of resistance convinces him he has mastered forces he no longer feels. Control feels complete precisely because it is no longer tested. He confuses smoothness for safety, mistaking silence for stability. You notice how the 6 mechanisms feed one another, forming a loop without an exit. Each advantage reinforces the next, sealing him inside momentum. Adaptation slows when survival feels guaranteed. He no longer rehearses failure, because failure has never reached him. Warning signs appear only at the margins, far from where decisions are made. You sense how power concentrates while awareness thins. The higher he rises, the quieter the signals become. Noise replaces information. Activity replaces thought. Growth continues by inertia alone. You feel the danger now lies not in loss, but in inability to respond. Flexibility fades when every structure is optimized for one direction. The system becomes brittle precisely because it feels strong. You realize resilience requires friction, and friction has been engineered away. When stress finally returns, it arrives everywhere at once. Momentum turns hostile the moment direction changes. Collapse begins when speed outruns perception. You feel how wealth, once a shield, now becomes a tunnel, narrowing vision while accelerating forward motion. The 6 mechanisms lock together, allowing speed, but forbidding retreat. He cannot slow without unraveling what keeps him elevated. You notice how exits disappear quietly, replaced by one-way corridors. The system demands continuation, mistaking stopping for collapse. Every signal now arrives too late to matter. Reaction time shrinks beneath the weight of scale. What once felt flexible now resists adjustment. The architecture rewards momentum and punishes hesitation. You sense panic forming beneath confidence, unspoken but present. Control persists only as long as conditions remain unchanged. Change becomes the enemy, not because it is harmful, but because it is incompatible. The six mechanisms amplify each other's weaknesses as efficiently as their strengths. Safety was built for one climate, not storms. When volatility returns, there is no muscle memory left. The system freezes, optimized for motion, not adaptation. You realize speed erased resilience. What once grew faster than everyone else now breaks faster too. Collapse does not announce itself. It accelerates silently. You understand now that momentum is not control. You watch how the system consumes its own safeguards to keep moving, burning protection as fuel. What once absorbed shocks is dismantled to preserve speed. Short-term survival overrides long-term coherence. You sense desperation hiding behind efficiency, urgency disguised as optimization. The six mechanisms no longer create advantage. They demand obedience. Every choice is framed as necessary, leaving no space for refusal. He becomes a caretaker of motion rather than a master of direction. Wealth stops serving purpose and starts demanding maintenance. You notice how scale magnifies fragility instead of strength. The larger the structure, the harder it is to steady. Small disturbances now propagate instantly. The system reacts everywhere because it understands nowhere. Control fragments into automated responses. Decision-making dissolves into reflex. You feel the loss of agency before the loss of wealth. Momentum becomes a prison with polished walls. The six mechanisms tighten, leaving no room to breathe. Growth persists, but it is hollow, echoing inside itself. You realize collapse is already happening, measured not in losses, but in options. The tragedy is sealed when stopping becomes impossible. You understand now that wealth grew fastest because it stopped listening, insulated from feedback that once kept it human. Speed replaced awareness, and momentum silenced doubt. The six mechanisms worked perfectly until they worked without consent. Control slipped not through error, but through excess refinement. What once felt powerful became fragile precisely because it was optimized. You see how distance from consequence erased the instinct to stop. The system could no longer feel pain, only motion. Without pain, correction became impossible. Growth continued long after meaning disappeared. You sense how wealth, detached from purpose, turns inward and collapses under its own echo. The tragedy was never inequality, but inevitability mistaken for intelligence. Advantage hardened into destiny. You realize the fastest growth carried the slowest awareness. What could not feel risk could not respect it. When pressure finally arrived, there was no language left to describe it. Response failed because perception had already faded. Collapse felt confusing, not dramatic. The mechanisms did not break. They completed themselves. You stand watching the system move perfectly, long after it should have stopped. This is how control ends, not with loss, but with irreversible motion.